try and record this to the cloud, though I'm also recording on a separate device, which is what I'm planning on uploading. But I'm just kind of trying some different things to see what works. So then, while the plant is growing, there's a lot going on. They are, almost all plants carry out photosynthesis and produce most of their own calories from sunlight. In other words, they convert the calories or the energy of sunlight into food, into a form of energy that they can use later and that other animals can use as well. So you can just think of calories as being energy. They're sunlight sort of frozen or stored in an electrochemical form, often in the form of sugars or starches. So that's kind of the most usual way for plants to store energy, although there are others as well. But all of that energy is ultimately coming from the sun. The sunlight is producing the energy, and the sunlight is releasing the energy from the hydrogen atoms that the sun is made out of, and some helium atoms that the sun is made out of. And then the plants are converting that energy into chemical energy, into food energy, which can be consumed by themselves or by consumers like grazing animals and humans and so forth. So ultimately, all of the calories in the food chain are coming by way of plants and coming from the energy of the sun. So you can think of the plants' energy as being solar energy that has been saved by the plants, that has been captured by the plants. And that mostly happens through the process of photosynthesis. And in photosynthesis, light causes a chemical reaction inside the cells, inside organelles in the cells, little structures inside the cells, especially chloroplasts, but not exclusively, where hydrogen and oxygen, which come from water and air, and carbon, which comes from air in the form of carbon dioxide especially, are transformed by the plant and by enzymes in the plant and chemical reactions that are powered by the sun energy. And the plant can turn those into different substances. And that is kind of a weird thing to think about, because a lot of people kind of operate under the assumption that plants get most of their material from soil. They get water from the soil and they get minerals from the soil, but most of the rest of what is in them actually comes from the air. So when you look at something like an oak tree and it's these, thousands of pounds of solid material, that solid material is, a lot of it is cellulose. Cellulose is long chains of carbohydrates, long chains of sugar made into a very strong structural material. So it's mostly oxygen and carbon dioxide and some water that has been turned into this very solid substance, bit by bit, molecule by molecule, inside the cells of plants in a chemical reaction that's powered by sunlight. So that's actually where most of the weight, most of the solid material that is in plants is coming from water and air, rather than from soil itself. And I think that that's a really neat thing. Now, you can't do that without the soil or without the nutrients that are in the soil. It needs to have minerals from the soil in order to be able to run that process. But the actual product is mostly made from water and air. And that same process that makes the cellulose, which is not only the structural part of wood, but of most other plants, or a big component of the structural material of most other plants. We might call it fiber in some dietary contexts. A big part of that is it's just kind of the same stuff as starch or as sugar. But whereas sugar is a single unit, you can think of sugar as being a single unit, a single, we call them saccharides, but a single clustering of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, a single carbohydrate. Starches are several of those stitched together, and cellulose is thousands of them stitched together, or hundreds of them stitched together. So it's very, very large molecule, or very large type of molecule. And it's one of the primary things that you find in plants. It's a very ubiquitous thing in plants, to find both sugars and starches and cellulose. You can find all three of those in some form in most plants, not necessarily in large quantities. You know that some plants are mostly just water, or a lot of plants are mostly water, but some plants don't seem to have much in them other than water. You know, it's a very small portion of what's there. But those substances are almost always present. They're what we call ubiquitous substances. We could also describe them as being primary phytochemicals, meaning that they're kind of essential to the life process of the plant. And therefore found in most plants. So at the same time that process is going on, there are a lot of other processes going on where other substances are being created in the plants. And so it's storing up food, it's making structural substances, which includes cellulose, it's making reproductive structures and so forth, seeds and things like that, which often contain not only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but also nitrogen. Nitrogen is basically the difference between a starch and an amino acid. It's also derived from the air. The air is mostly nitrogen gas, which humans don't really use directly in any, well, that's not necessarily true. We tend to think of it as being largely inert when it comes to human physiology. But for plants, it's a big part of what they're using to manufacture things. When humans make proteins, we only have to make them out of other aminos from other things that we ate. We can't manufacture them. We can change which amino acid it is, but we can't really manufacture them out of the nitrogen in the air and carbohydrates the way that plants can. So it's another area where it all ultimately has to come from the plant kingdom. So a lot of these proteins that they make are, or amino acids that they make, are maybe part of their seed. Sometimes they are in proteins that are in the leaf, proteins that are in the stem and so forth, that are just part of the plant. But sometimes those substances have a medicinal effect. And that those are one of the categories of substances that can have a medicinal effect. There are amino acids and other organic acids, some of which we would describe as aromatic acids if they have sort of a particular structure and usually a strong smell to them. So an example of that would be, well, yeah, sort of an example of that would, of an organic acid would be valeric acid, which gives valerian its strong smell and also is one of the main things responsible for its medicinal properties. It happens to interact with the human nervous system in a way that that produces sleepiness, that slows down certain conduction of electricity in a way that has historically been used to control seizures, has been used to make the nervous system sort of work in a slower and smoother and more coordinated way. So that's, you know, an example of an aromatic acid. There are also other organic acids like tannic acid, Tannic acid is produced in oak trees and is the sort of brownish substance in fall leaves that tends to stain the sidewalk after the leaves get wet. It's also, if you cook up oak bark in water, it turns the water a dark brown color. It's called tannic acid because it's used to tan leather and impart that brownish color to it that we know as tan in the English language. And so that's another example of an organic acid. And there are thousands of them. There are a whole lot of different possible ways that plants can take a few substances, because almost most of your plant chemicals are mostly made out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Occasionally you get an atom here or there of some other substance, but most of them are just different organizations, sometimes extremely complex organizations of those substances, of those atoms. And we won't get into exactly how they're organized in very much depth here, but there are a lot of different categories of substances that are found in plants, and acids are one of them. Acids tend to have a sour or acrid taste to them, and they are often, but not always, found in the above ground parts of plants. It depends a lot on the plant, but often above ground parts, like last week we talked about the dandelions. Dandelions have more acid in their above ground parts than they have in their roots. So the sour taste is kind of what you would most easily recognize as being part of the acidity. And part of what makes them acid is that they have hydrogen atoms on them that can be kind of spit out by the molecule when it's dissolved in water. So it has to do with how they interact. They have a lower pH than neutral. So pH is kind of a measurement of how acidic or how alkaline something is. 7 is neutral. I don't know why someone came up with this particular system. 7 is neutral, but it can be as low as 0 and as high as 14. Yeah, it just seems like a fairly random set of numbers. But anyway, acids tend to be lower pH. Alkaline substances are higher pH, although most things are pretty close to 7 if you're talking about stuff that's occurring in living organisms. Sorry, my recording on this thing just went off. I don't understand why. I don't know what's going on with that. Well, it's making me nervous, but I'm trying to record this the best that I can. So, where was I? Okay, so another category are what are called alkaloids. Alkaloids are often stored in the roots of plants. They tend to be very bitter. These are what are called secondary phytochemicals. They're not something that the plant necessarily needs to live, but they fulfill some particular function for the plant. We often assume or believe that these plant substances are there to be protective. For example, that they're there to keep creatures from eating a plant because of the bitterness that they produce. I don't really feel like that's an entirely satisfactory answer as to why they're there, but largely there's the belief that they're there because they perform some sort of function that keeps the plants from getting eaten by insects or by grazing animals or whatever. And sometimes you can definitely see how that would work. You know, if something, if most animals ate a very spicy pepper, they wouldn't necessarily want that. Although peppers are kind of not necessarily a great example of that, because the really spicy ones are the ones that are grown by people that have been selectively grown to have that spiciness. So sometimes plants that have a relationship with humans develop certain characteristics because that's what gets them cultivated by humans. So, you know, if something becomes a popular cultivar, it's going to be a lot more biologically successful, a lot better at reproducing itself than if it doesn't have desirable characteristics. So you can find a lot of our medicinal plants, a lot of our weeds, things like that have developed the way they've developed partly because of their relationship with humans. A really striking example of that from modern times would probably be cannabis. Cannabis is hemp and also marijuana. It's the same plant, but there's different varieties, different cultivars. Originally, back when people first started writing about it a couple thousand years ago, it was really all the same plant, but some people noticed that if you took the certain parts of the plant and put them on hot stones and breathed in the steam and smoke from that it would give you a euphoric sort of feeling. And so people started cultivating them for those strains and cultivating other strains for having, started cultivating some strains for those characteristics while cultivating other strains for different characteristics, like having long fibers, long stems, so that they had long fibers that could be used for spinning into rope and cloth. So eventually they kind of diverged into what we would now think of as two very different purposes. You have hemp plants and then you have marijuana plants. They're the same species, basically same type of plant, but grown for selected for very different traits. And even within the last few decades, the concentration of the psychoactive substances, especially THC, is much stronger in some of the strains that are around now compared to the strains that were around a few decades ago, say in the 1970s. So it's a plant that has developed a lot and developed changed much more quickly than it would have under the process of natural selection, because people were doing things with it to make it happen that way. And that's true of a lot of plants out there. It's true of a lot of medicinal plants. Some plants that freely hybridize or that have a lot of genetic variation within their species are much more available for that sort of thing. So you have things like peppers and mints, for example. There's for both of those a stunning array of different varieties that aren't necessarily different species, but that have very different characteristics, or maybe sometimes they are different species or different hybrids. Just a second. All right, so yeah, when plants have a relationship with humans like that, that often results in them developing certain traits more quickly, or developing traits that they're being cultivated for more quickly. In the wild, it has more to do with growing conditions, predation. Sometimes if plants are brought to a different area, they'll grow differently than they did in their native area. Sometimes plants actually have a pretty wide variety of ways that they can grow, and certain tendencies that they would grow in a particular way in one area versus another. to give an example, poison ivy, if it's growing in a field where there aren't trees, a lot of the time it will sort of grow as a little bush. Sometimes it will grow along the ground, but sometimes it will grow as a little shrub. It doesn't have anything to climb up. If it has a wall or a tree or something like that to climb up, it always prefers to do that because it can get up into more sunlight and spread itself out in a way that can get more sunlight, collect more energy, and produce more of the substances that it produces. So, and of course, those substances are the stuff that makes you itchy, right? So poison ivy that's growing in full sun might be more powerful, or at least more prolific in how many leaves it's putting out and how much of the itchy stuff it's making spread out over its entire self, compared to one that's growing in more full shade. And eventually, when you get into deeper shade in the woods, you don't get so much poison ivy anymore, because it's not really getting the ideal growing conditions that it would want. So it doesn't tend to get started in those situations. There might be some still growing there from before it was deep woods, but it doesn't tend to start making a lot of new ones in deeper woods, not as much as it does along the edges of the woods and on trails and in places where there are breaks in the woods that let the light in. So in addition to growing from seeds, plants often grow vegetatively, by which I mean that part of the plant breaks off and becomes a different plant. A good example of this from the garden would be potatoes. You can grow potatoes from seed, but you can also grow potatoes from the eyes of another potato. So it has the small buds growing on the surface of the potato itself, and you can plant those and they're capable of growing into a new plant. And that will have a genetic structure that's identical or very nearly identical to the parent plant, because it only has the one parent. It doesn't have, it's not a seed that has two sets of parents, two sets of genetic information. It's essentially a clone. And a lot of plants are capable of growing from cuttings like that. You can, with some types of plants, you can trim part of the branch off and put it upside down in some water and have it grow some roots. And the reason that you're able to do that is because of a type of tissue called meristematic tissue, which is kind of similar to what might be called stem cells in animals, but stems in plants are a different thing. So anyway, it's bud tissue, it's buds. It's the undifferentiated cells that can turn into any type of plant tissue that they need to, if given the right impetus, which is going to be partly hormonal, partly based on messaging within the plant's tissues, but that is influenced by the environment. So a lot of plants that grow near water, have this strategy of being able to root into water and put out a new plant from that rooting, or turn into a new plant from that rooting. Some plants have what are called runners, where they'll kind of grow along the surface of the ground and put down roots periodically, and those can become separate plants. Some plants have rhizomes, which are similar to runners, but they're under the ground. They're actually an underground, they're more like stem than roots, but they look kind of like roots, or people often think of them as roots because they grow under the ground, kind of maybe considered part of the root system. A good example of that from familiar medicinal herbs would be ginger. Ginger is kind of jointed, branching, underground thing that puts up leaves here and there. And if you break it in half, it can grow one set of leaves and flowers from one end and one set of leaves and flowers from the other end. So it's capable of asexual reproduction, of vegetative reproduction, or in other words, making a clone of itself. And that's a very common strategy in plants. Not all plants use that. And so that's an important thing to know about whether plants are capable of growing that way. For example, one of the medicinal herbs that is very widely collected where I'm from and is a kind of a minor commercial product is golden seal. Golden seal it's not the most harvestable thing. It is like actually somewhat environmentally sensitive. It's easy to over harvest. It takes a long time to grow and so forth. But some people, when they're tending a golden seal patch, will divide the rootstock. They'll actually cut off part of the underground root and replant the other part of it with the hope that the part they replanted grows back next year and grows into a new root and doesn't take as long to reach a particular harvestable size as it would take to go all the way from seed to producing a plant that size. So that's that's a way that some people would do that. I usually would not do it that way because there's a chance that the part that you divided is actually going to die. So my strategy personally is to not do that and just take a smaller amount. But there are people who do it that way, and you could do it that way with some plants. You can do it that way with golden seal. You could do it that way with certainly with ginger, with irises. They do very well with that sort of thing. But ginseng, you can't do that with. If you try it, it's just going to kill the plant, and you're only going to take half of it and leave the other half in the ground to rot. So it's not the right kind of plant for that. Mayapple is an interesting one because if you find a patch of mayapple out in the forest, sometimes, I don't know if you've ever seen this plant. It has an umbrella-shaped leaf. It's dark green. It's growing right now. You'll have a big patch of it, but if you start to dig it up underground, you'll find that they're often all the same plant, and it's like a net made out of these underground root parts. The underground root system of the plant, it spreads out through the whole forest floor, and so it's actually all the same plant with a bunch of different stems. But it's also possible for those to get broken off and put somewhere else. And grow back as a new plant. So that's something you see more often in longer lived plants. It's not really a strategy that you would see very much in, with grasses, you see runners and things like that. But with flowering plants, you don't tend to see a lot of them that have that type of strategy if they grow from seed very quickly. But if they don't grow from seed very quickly, it gives them a very decided advantage to be able to also reproduce without these seeds. So. Now, some other kinds of plants, like ferns, they actually reproduce by spores. Spores are like little specks of dust that can get blown on the wind. And if they land in the right place, they can grow into an entire fern or entire club moss or something like that. So these plants don't actually have seeds and flowers. They have little pockets of spores on the undersides of their leaves. Which is more like what mushrooms have in a way. It's not actually quite the same structure, but it looks similar. It's like a speck of dust that can grow into a new one. And so that part is similar. The exact biology and mechanics behind it is more like an analogous structure. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's we call both of them spores. And they're both distributed largely by wind, but also by water. So those plants grow a little differently. Their reproductive strategy is a little different, but they also photosynthesize. They also have a lot of the same, what we call metabolic pathways. Metabolic pathway is in plants are sort of sets of chain reactions where common substances that are part of plant physiology can be made into other substances, can be converted by enzymes and by energy to less common substances. So you start out with ubiquitous substances, things that are in all sorts of plants, and then certain plants will make minor variations to those to make chemicals that act very differently, to make substances that behave very differently physiologically. And that's why certain substances are mostly found in a particular family of plants. A really famous example of this would be opioids. They're very common in plants in the poppy family. They're not really common, maybe barely, if at all, present outside of that family. By contrast, caffeine, which is another very familiar substance, caffeine is based on you can say caffeine is based on xanthic acid, which is a very common plant substance, but there are only a handful of plants scattered across a few different unrelated plant families, or well, not closely related plant families, that have caffeine in them, in which this xanthic acid gets transformed into this caffeine. So it's a different, a slight variation that doesn't show up very often. But it's in tea, it's in some types of holly, and it's in coffee. And so it's something that comes up in these plants that are not necessarily that close to one another, but they're all making it from the same common plant substance. So there are certain substances that you find throughout the plant world, and there are certain substances that you only find in a handful of plants, or in a group of related plants. And so I feel like that it's helpful to know what the substances are that we know of in a plant that you're using. But I also feel like it's important to keep in mind that you don't know all the substances in any plant, and that the substances that you think are making it work might not always be the substances making it work. So, for example, in black tea, we know about the caffeine in tea. We've known about that for a long time. There's another substance in it called theophylline. We've known about that for a long time too. And both of those substances have some stimulant properties. Both of them tighten up the blood vessels a little bit. In more recent times, we've also found out that there are a lot of antioxidants that are in the same plant that play some different roles in how it feels in people's bodies and in its reputed effects on longevity and things like that. That aren't necessarily, the substances that people were initially focusing on when they first knew about it. So, there are often things that we don't know yet, maybe things that we will never know about what's in plants that make them work. But when we do know about, I think it's important with any plant that you're trying to become familiar with, to kind of find out what you can about the substances that make it work, or that we know of that might be contributing to making it work. And reading about the phytochemistry of the plant is one way of doing it. Tasting the plant is another way of doing it. You can say, okay, this plant is bitter, so I know that this plant is going to provoke bile production, or this plant is sour, and I can feel that when I taste this plant that my mouth produces more saliva. You can kind of tell some things like that as you get used to working with plants. Uh, so plants, whenever you're selecting plants, whether you're growing them, whether you're harvesting them, or even if you're buying them, there are certain things that you want to look at about the plant that are going to tell you about whether the plant is likely to have good medicine or not. And one of these things is the color of the plant. You can look at if a plant is very pale while it's growing, it usually means that it's not getting enough sunlight. Sometimes it means that there's not enough of the right minerals in the soil or some other things. But a lot of the time that is a weakness that has to do with it not receiving enough energy from the sun. Now, if it's a old harvested plant material that's been around for a while, it can actually lose a lot of its greenness too. And that can be similarly a sign that it's gotten weak, even though it's for a different reason. But that color of the plant material is something you want to look at. It doesn't smell the way it should is kind of, for me, the biggest thing. I'm much more, if I'm, if I've got some mint, for example, I want it to be minty. I don't really, there is mint out there that is not minty, even if it grows in the right conditions, because it just does not have the right genetics to make the menthol and other substances that make it smell minty. So if it doesn't have those substances, maybe it's not what I want. If it maybe is too old, or it was grown in the wrong soil or the wrong sunlight, or if it doesn't have the right genetics, all of those will result in it not having the right smell. So the smell for me is actually the most direct way and the kind of richest way of telling if a plant has the substances in it, if it grew the way it needed to grow and has the stuff in it that it needs to have. So I would encourage everybody to go around smelling some different herbal materials, whether it's maybe coffee or spices. Careful not to snort them up your nose, but or just even plants that are growing around you. Last time I said find a stand of plants, find an area where there's some plants growing. It doesn't have to be the same area all the time. Somebody had mentioned to me that they found a stand of plants, but that the area was going to get developed or whatever. Sometimes that sort of thing is out of our control. But really try and familiarize yourself with what the plant smells like. Because if you know what yarrow smells like when it's fresh and growing, and then you encounter some yarrow that doesn't smell like that, that maybe it's not the right stuff, or it's not got what you need. So that's a way of interacting directly with the plants, and a way that I think is important for people to familiarize themselves with. Hang on a second. So one of the things that you might read about if you read about the life cycle of plants and how they grow is the idea of there being vital plant nutrients, and especially nitrogen. People will talk a lot about nitrogen and nitrogen fixation and how that relates to plants and their physiology. And so, I mentioned that nitrogen is kind of ubiquitous in the atmosphere. It's a big part of the atmosphere, and that it's a big part of what plants use to make their vital substances. But part of what's going on there is the nitrogen actually being converted into a usable form, not only by the plants, but by bacteria that are working along with the plants, or that are kind of part of the same ecosystem as the plants. that are helping to, people would say, fix the nitrogen or make the nitrogen into a usable form. And we're actually learning more and more that soil microbiome doesn't always, but can have a big effect on the medicinal properties of plants and on the way that plants grow. So, for the last almost 100 years since people came up with what would they now call conventional agriculture, which is just kind of like, agriculture that's very heavy in use of fertilizers and pesticides and so forth. People have been kind of looking at plants as though they basically were a combination of a couple of different fertilizer chemicals and, making sure they don't get eaten. And that's kind of what a lot of focus has gone into. And there really hasn't been this notion that the soil should be a living thing. In fact, quite the contrary. People often spray the soil with something to try and kill everything in it. And if all you're trying to do is grow calories, you can maybe get away with that sort of thing. It seems that you can still grow plenty of corn or wheat or whatever on land that's been treated in that sort of way. But when it comes to medicine, it doesn't work so well. You end up with plants that are not getting some of the time the predecessors of plant chemicals, or some of the substances that go into making the plant chemicals what they are, actually come from microbes in the soil. So just like, and this is kind of, we're finding the same thing out about human physiology as well, that microorganisms play a much bigger role than was initially suspected in making things work the way that they should, and in providing the backbones of the chemical substances that need to be elaborated by metabolism. So plants' metabolism is equally very strongly affected by what microbes are growing around their roots, what microbes are growing in their soil, and also what funguses are growing in their soil. And we've known this about some plants for a long time. Certain orchids, for example, will only grow if there's certain funguses in the soil. They have a symbiotic relationship with them, or at least they have a relationship that benefits the plant, and by which it's able to live in when it wouldn't be able to if these other things weren't in the soil, helping it to use the nutrients that are there and helping it to have the substances that it needs to grow and thrive. So that's a thing to keep in mind also about plants. They might grow in adverse conditions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have their full range of medicinal potency. I kind of came upon this fact several years ago. This has been probably in the late 1990s or so. I went to someplace where they were growing ginseng, and someone was telling me about their ginseng growing operation. They had all these acres of ginseng growing. Rather than being in the woods, it was being grown under shade cloths, under these sort of little screens in frames that were over the plants. And it was very much a conventional agricultural type of operation. They were using fungicides, they were using the shade cloths, they were growing it out in plowed fields. Whereas where I'm from, if somebody plants ginseng, they poke a hole in the ground with their finger and they put the seed in the hole, and then they put some dirt and leaves over the hole that they poked with their finger. And that's how you grow ginseng in the woods. And so this was very different for me. I was like, wow, people are growing on just astonishing amount of ginseng. But when I tasted it, it didn't taste like ginseng. I mean, it was ginseng. It was relatively healthy looking ginseng, but the taste of it was just not right. It was like, okay, there's something really critical missing here. And I suspect that part of the something really critical missing is the what it's absorbing from its ecology, what substances are in the soil, what microorganisms are in the soil, and so forth, and that that it's missing something that it needs in order to make the stuff that goes into it that makes it what it is. And with some of this ginseng, they do actually have it looked at in labs, not necessarily from this particular farm, but a lot of cultivated ginseng people do look at it in labs and look at the amounts of the ginsenosides, which are sort of one of the substances in ginsengs that are kind of thought of as the substance in ginseng, the thing that makes it do what it does. And sometimes it's there, but I really just think that there's a lot more to the story, and probably other cofactors that we don't have names for, and things like that are not what they need to be. Yeah, synergistic co-metabolism, someone says, and that's it's just like one set of chain reaction happens in the microbe puts out a substance that's been made through that part of the reaction, and then the plant takes up the product of that set of reactions and makes it into something else. And if the first set of reactions isn't there, then it's not going to make it. And because these are secondary chemicals, they're not like vital substances for the plant to live. The plant goes on living, and it just doesn't have all the substances it would normally have. So, it's if you're as you're looking around yourself, as you're kind of developing your ecology as an herbalist and your relationship to the plants around you and getting to know them, look at where the plants are growing and how they're growing, and notice that there are different things that there are a lot of different things that might play a role in how well a plant grows and how medicinal it becomes from its environment. And that's something that you can't always see right away, but it's something that you develop a sense of as you grow as an herbalist. You learn to recognize where things are, and how the plants are growing and what they might be accumulating from the soil, good or bad. Because sometimes plants actually will soak up a lot of minerals from the soil, and sometimes that's not a good thing. If there's, for example, a lot of arsenic in soil, you don't want the plants that grow there, because for the most part, minerals can't become anything other than what they already are, in terms of like arsenic will never not be arsenic. Lead will never not be lead, no matter what kind of biological processes it goes through. It can become more or less toxic forms of either of those substances, but it's going to stay the same essential substance. It's going to have the same elemental structure, and that's not actually a thing that can change. Similarly, if a substance isn't in the soil, a plant can't contain it that is growing in that soil, if it's a mineral, if it's an element. So, for example, people talk about certain plants containing a lot of iron, for instance. And my favorite iron-containing plant is a wild plant called purslane. And purslane tends to grow in iron-rich soil. But in the city, it will often grow in places that are polluted by iron. For example, if there's a sewer grate or a manhole cover or something like that in the sidewalk, purslane loves to grow right up against that, because it's a lot of iron that's coming off of it as it's rusting. And that's not necessarily where I want my food and medicine to come from. So I tend to not, especially if I'm using it for anyone other than myself, not gather that from the sidewalk, where it's going to be like soaking up a lot of rust from man-made stuff, but gather it from bare ground somewhere. The ground here in Lexington actually contains quite a bit of iron, and we have this reddish clay soil in different places. And that's the iron is actually what's making it red. The kind of iron oxides or rust in the soil.
A bunch of those.
Okay. So yeah, it's important to look at what's growing around plants and whether they're going to be absorbing things like that. But also, it's important to know that they need certain things to be already in the soil, and that the quantities of any mineral in any plant is going to be largely geological. Somebody has their audio on, and it's kind of making some noise. So maybe check and make sure that you're muted if you've got some noise going on in your background.
What class to make it worth listening to now?
Did you have a...
It'll be recorded. I'll get it tomorrow.
Yeah, let's see. Okay. Let's see. I've covered everything I need to about that. So just like other things, plants have a life cycle, and they live a certain amount of time and then they die. For trees, of course, that can be so long that it seems almost irrelevant to humans. There are plenty of trees that are hundreds of years old, or far older than any human has ever lived, and that's not really even that old for most trees. Kind of depends on the kind of tree too. Some trees don't live as long as others. For some birch trees, for instance, they usually live, I don't know, like 60, 70 years. Oak trees, they can live really, really long time. I don't know how long oak trees can live, many hundreds of years. Yew trees and some bristlecone pines and redwoods can live thousands of years. But most plants don't live that long. There are some woodland plants, some woodland herbs that live for several years. Ginseng might live 100 years sometimes, although most of the time, it doesn't. It's much more often for it to live 6 or 8 years. And then there are a lot of, so those are perennials. They'll kind of grow year after year in the same place. Maybe they'll grow for decades. Some of them may grow longer than that. But a lot of the time it's just, a matter of several years. And then there are annuals, biennials, or another category called monocarpic perennials that only grow for a few years. Annuals tend to just kind of grow for one season, then they die off, and then they're not there anymore, although they may reseed themselves and have new ones come up in the same spot. So it's totally possible to have a stand of an annual plant that grows and grows for years and years in the same place. Biennials usually grow leaves one year, and then the next year they grow a stem with flowers. And so that would be, and then they die. So that would be a process where the first year they're just producing the leaves, they're just gathering energy. That's all they're doing. They're soaking up the sun's energy. They're gathering the energy and saving it up in the root. And then the following year, they put out leaves again. They grow another, they're still gathering energy from the sun in those leaves, but then they also will put up a stem that will have a flower on it. And then and then that will go to seed. And then a monocarpic perennial just means it may grow for multiple years, but it only fruits once. And that's, kind of a lot of the time, that's things that we think of as biennials might actually be more accurately described as that. For example, I have a mullein plant at my house right now. That's a lot of people would describe mullein as a biennial, but I have a plant that's 5 years old, and it's still growing. It hasn't put up a stem yet. It's kind of growing in not the most ideal space. It's growing in the shade in a crack in some pavement underneath my mobile clinic, underneath my trailer. So it's, it's not getting enough energy stored up to do the reproductive part of the process. So it hasn't finished its life cycle. It just keeps putting up a set of leaves on the ground. So it has like a basal rosette of leaves, a circle of leaves on the ground, all emanating from the same spot. And the stem would come up from that same spot, but it hasn't ever. So, that's something that you will often see in plants growing in more adverse conditions. That one just happened to occur because I brought home some mullein, and it was a flowering stalk. And with mullein, part of the stalk is in flower while part of it's turning into fruit. And it got left outside. And so the part that had gone to fruit went to seed, scattered seed on the pavement. And some of the seeds found their way into places in the pavement where they could grow. And so I just kind of thought it looked neat. So I left it there. I was like, okay, this is my driveway plant. And it's been growing in the same spot for 5 years now, since 2018. So it's, keeping an eye on it, seeing how it does, but it's just sort of a novel thing to watch it. But that's a plant that likes to grow in rocky soil. Different plants have different preferences to where they grow, obviously, because they need different amounts of water. They also need different amounts of drainage. Some things will grow well in a clay type soil that stays wet once it gets wet. Some things prefer to grow in sand or in amongst gravel and chunks of rocks where the water just kind of runs down their roots and then is gone, and the roots don't stay damp. So depending on the plant, what's ideal conditions for one plant might be deadly conditions for another plant. A water lily and a cactus, have completely different ideas about what constitutes a good place to grow. And so that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're used to gardening. Most of the plants that we grow for food are things that yield large amounts of calories when they're grown in direct sunlight. That's kind of like the usual criteria for what makes a good crop. So if you're used to thinking in those kinds of terms, you have to think a little bit differently when you're thinking about medicine, because it's not always a matter of, it's not a matter of how many calories they contain. And so it's not always a matter of the same types of sunlight conditions and soil conditions and so forth. Interestingly, when you look at traditional systems of agriculture that were subsistence systems rather than commercial systems of growing cash crops or more, what's a good word for it? Ones that were designed to support a workforce other than the people growing the food. When you look outside of that and look at more traditional subsistence styles of growing things, you actually get a wider variety of ways of growing among the plants than you tend to see in places where people were like, okay, we've got a workforce to feed. We're going to plow and cultivate and grow as many calories on as little land as we can. And then we're either going to store that up and give the grain to the workers, or else we're going to sell it and, buy land and grow more food or whatever it is. When you look into places where it's just more like people growing food for themselves and their animals, you get more variety in terms of, this is the land that we've got. And so we're going to have the woods here, and it's going to have some nut trees, and we're going to cut down the trees that don't grow nuts, but we won't cut down the nut trees and or the fruit trees often. So you get like an overstory of nut trees and an understory of berries, something like that. And, pond plants that are edible and things like that, that people kind of selectively cultivated or stewarded. And sometimes you can still find places, even if the people who planted them are long gone, where there are, hedgerows of berry bushes and, nut trees and things like that were maybe planted or cultivated or at least not cut down. So it's not that unusual to go into a part of the forest and find an area where you've got hickory trees that are over 100 years old, and then the other trees aren't that old. And that, because people were growing the hickories either for themselves or for maybe their pigs or to attract other animals that eat them, that they hunted. So, there has tended to be a history of people having a more direct relationship with their land and valuing different types of land and different types of plant communities that is pretty different from the commercialized focus on what you might call arable land that can be plowed and planted with crops that yield a lot of calories in direct sunlight. So when you're thinking about herbs, don't necessarily think of them in terms of being like farm crops. Think of them in terms of being living things that develop characteristics to fill all the various niches of the environment and the terrain around you. Because just about any kind of place that there will be certain types of plants that are well adapted to growing in that place, whether it's, on top of a boulder where you get ferns and sometimes orchids, or whether it's in the shade of the woods where you get winter annuals that soak up their sun's energy while the trees don't have leaves on them, and then put out their seeds at the same time that the trees are putting out their leaves or a little before. So a lot of different strategies, a lot of different ways that life is found to thrive in different areas. And along with each of those different ways of growing, you get different sets of medicines, different types of substances that the plants elaborate that we can take advantage of, or that we can find and use to our own benefit and to that of the people around us. Any question on that part before I go into talking about a couple of medicinal plants? All right. So I want to talk about two medicinal plants again today. And once again, both of these are going to be very common plants that you might be able to find in abundance in your environment, depending on what your environment is, where you live. Certainly, you'll be able to find them in my environment. I encourage everyone to get to know the plants that are around you. And these are two plants that you might be able to find in your environment right now. Let's see. Can I do something here? One of them, the first one that I want to talk about, is somewhat confusingly called plantain. Plantago is its name in English. I mean, it's its Latin name. Plantain is its name in English, which is also the name of a type of banana. But I'm not talking about the type of banana. I'm talking about a common weed that grows in people's yards called plantain. And there are a few different species, all of which are essentially interchangeable medicinally. This is a plant that contains some, that has large round leaves that have some parallel venation here. I'm going to actually walk outside and see if I can find it. It's a very common plant that grows in just about everybody's yard in this part of North America.
I have some right beside me right now.
Yeah, do you?
Show.
Yeah, it's a real common one. What's that?
Turn around.
Where is it? It's on here. This has been mowed too thoroughly.
I've got some right here.
Okay, can we see that? I don't know. Where are you?
I'm here.
Okay, yeah, I see it. Yeah, that's a great example of it. Yeah, it's a very common plant. Looks just like that. So one of the things that I like this plant for is it's basically useful for injuries. My favorite application of it is for stings. If you crush it up and put it on a bee sting or a wasp sting, it takes the sting right out of it. So we've used this a lot when I do first aid at festivals, because there are often a lot of little kids running around and things like that. And sometimes somebody will step on a bee or a wasp, get stung on the foot. You can crush this stuff up and put it on there, and it takes the sting right out of it. You can also put it on a splinter or rub it on a splinter, and it'll often get the splinter to come out. It's what's called an astringent. And an astringent, what makes it an astringent is that it causes the tissue to sort of tighten up and contract. Here's some. So here's the leaf, and it's got veins that kind of run along the length of it. It's a very sort of leaf-shaped leaf, kind of spoon-shaped maybe. Often grows in disturbed ground, lawns, path sides, things like that. It has a really interesting strategy for getting distributed, which is that if you're walking along in your bare feet in tall grass, the seed heads will come off between your toes. And so you end up distributing the seeds by walking barefoot. And presumably this happens to cloven-hooved animals as well as people. But it is distributed by foot traffic, maybe also in the treads of muddy boots, maybe even vehicle treads. So it gets around. It's been kind of spread throughout the world in the course of European imperialism. So it is often found in temperate regions in North America, which is not native to, but it's very common here. It doesn't tend to outcompete other plants. It just kind of grows along with grass a lot of the time. Because people have planted so much grass, it's very common to find it in grassy areas. And you'll also find it like if you're going down roads where Not a lot of people go dirt roads where the middle of the road has stuff growing in it. It loves to grow there. So anyway, it's a very widely distributed weed. It contains tannic acid, which is an astringent, and like I said, the astringency tightens up tissue, and in so doing can push out splinters. But it can also be used for things like acne, where there's maybe a lot of oil or something like that being produced by the skin to tighten up the pores. It also contains some salicin, which is an anti-inflammatory. Contains some anti-inflammatory substances, and it contains some mucilage, which is slippery, soothing stuff. So it can be used on burns. It's not my favorite thing on burns, but it's often handy. It can be used on sunburns pretty well. You can actually crush it up and put it on your skin, put the juice on your skin to prevent sunburns. I used to do that when I didn't have anything else that I could use. Although if you have very pale skin, the greenishness might show up some. Although is only noticeable for a minute, but it's a very common plant, and the leaf is the best part to use. The seeds are very astringent. They're also edible. They're basically like a grain. You can soak them in water to get some of the astringency, soak them in cold water to get some of the astringency out of them, and then cook them into a sort of porridge. And that contains a lot of fiber, has some laxative effects. The fiber laxative psyllium is a very closely related species. And so that's a really good plant to know. It's a really good plant to show your kids. If you have kids in your life, because they're always hurting themselves and they love to have something that they can just use themselves. It makes them feel like they've got some kind of competence and ability. So it's empowering for them to know about it. And it's, safe enough that you don't really have to worry about them doing anything harmful with it. It's not like, giving them a bottle of Advil or something like that. It's a good topical remedy for scrapes and cuts and all sorts of things like that, because it helps them to heal up faster and has a little bit of antiseptic ability to it. So you can usually just kind of crush it up until it gets juicy and then put it on whatever area hurts. So that's a really good herb to know about, and that's the first one that I wanted to talk about today. The second one is yarrow. Yarrow is also a vulnerary. It's also an herb that's used for wounds. Yarrow has a feathery leaf that is sort of a slightly fuzzy whitish color, greenish white color, and the tops of yarrow are white. There are some garden ornamental varieties of yarrow that are pink or yellow, but the real stuff is white. Yarrow is kind of genetically complicated. There's a lot of genetic variation within yarrow, even though a lot of it tends to look very similar. When people start actually looking at the chromosomes and genes in the plant, it's complicated. But it's also a weed. It is native apparently to North America as well as Europe and Asia. It has a very long history of use for injuries, often as a poultice, which is just taking the leaves, crushing them up, and putting them on the injury. Sometimes in other forms, like a wash, where the yarrow is made into an infusion, basically a tea, and then wounds are washed with that. Sometimes as a powder of the dried herb applied directly to the wound, which I don't like to do, but some people do, and that's a very traditional way of using it. The Latin name of yarrow is Achillea, is the genus name, Achillea millefolium. Millefolium means thousand-leaved because the leaves they're very finely divided. And Achillea, after Achilles, who was one of the characters in the Iliad, in the story of the Trojan War. And in that story, he's actually using the yarrow for battlefield injuries, grinding it up and putting the powder directly on wounds. In this case, sword wounds and spear wounds and things like that. In my lifetime, I've gotten to use yarrow for some fairly serious injuries, some of which were when I was in some other places outside of the United States, and working with people who had been in armed conflicts and things like that. So there were some serious injuries. My favorite story about using yarrow for myself is from when I was a teenager, and I was out in the woods and I was climbing around on some rocks, and I slipped and fell and hit my face. And I reached up and touched my face. It was kind of bloody. So there was a creek right there. I got some water from the creek and tried to rinse out the inside of my mouth because I thought I just kind of like busted my lip or whatever. And the water drained out of my mouth while my mouth was closed without me swallowing it or spitting it out. And I was like, oh, that's really bad. So I tried it again just to make sure. And it was the same thing. It was like I actually had a hole all the way from the inside of my mouth to the outside that wasn't supposed to be there. So I was like, well, I'm going to have to go and see if I can get stitches or something like that. I didn't really know how to go about getting stitches or how to make that happen, really. So I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I was ways out in the woods anyway, and I had to get back to where I could go back to town before I could do that. So in the meantime, I crushed up some yarrow and packed it on the inside and put some on the outside and held it there as well. And by the time I got back to town a couple hours later, the wound had actually closed up, and I was able to drink water and things like that. It was, obviously still there. It was still laceration, but it wasn't whole anymore. And so I didn't end up getting stitches, and just kind of did basic wound care after that. And it knitted back together well enough that didn't leave so much of a scar or anything like that. Probably not the ideal way to treat that injury, but it was what I felt like I had access to at the time, and it did the job pretty well. I never had any complications from it or anything like that. So most of the time, if I'm using yarrow topically, what I like to do is actually sort of a modified poultice, rather than just putting the crushed herb directly on the wound, is to have something like a thin piece of cloth that the herb is folded up in, so that when it's lifted off of the wound, it's not leaving bits of particles behind, not leaving pieces behind, because I really don't like to do that. It's the same reason I don't like to use powder directly on a wound. So I find that actually works better than a compress, which is like a piece of cloth soaked in the infusion. But if you just, which will carry a lot of the same stuff. And actually here in the clinic, I don't usually keep fresh yarrow because it doesn't stay fresh for very long. I keep it in a tincture form that's about 10% alcohol and has a tiny bit of a lichen in it as a preservative, but it's a very low alcohol concentration so that it won't burn when it's put on a wound. But it's just that liquid. And then I would put that on a cloth and put the cloth on the wound that it was soaked in the liquid. And that's the form that I have it here, both in this clinic and in the medicine wagon, my mobile clinic, in that liquid form. I find that the fresh herb is the best if you can get it, but it's not around all year. It starts coming up pretty early in the spring. It starts coming up in April. It just looks like little feathery things, little feathery leaves, and then it puts up its stem. Right about now here in Kentucky is when it's starting to bloom. Maybe a week ago or so, but fairly, late April, early May is when you'll start to see some flowers of it. And around this time, mid to late May is a great time to harvest it. If you find a field of yarrow, you can often find, it's often very easy because the plant's often like 3 feet tall. And you can go around with a pair of clippers or something like that. And I've gathered 100 pounds of it in a day, which 100 pounds of yarrow looks like a lot. It's like, a couple of gigantic bundles of it, like hay bales of yarrow. So, and then of course it's much less than 100 pounds once it's dried, but you can gather a lot of it, and then you can save it up. You can actually also dry the herb and then wet the herb and make a poultice out of the wet. I make a poultice out of the re-wetted, previously dried herb. Hang on just a second. Plug myself in here. Okay. Yeah. So that's an alternative to using the fresh herb. It's kind of intermediate between using it as a wash and using it as a poultice, is to make a poultice out of the dried herb wrapped in a piece of cloth, or muslin is a traditional type of cloth to use for that, and it's pretty cheap. Some people want to use paper towels. I wouldn't use like a paper towel that's going to release bits of fiber. Some of the paper towels that have a more cloth-like consistency are more suitable, but you don't want that's going to release bits of paper into the wound. Because again, I'm really trying to keep foreign particles out of wounds. I don't like that at all. Some people are much more comfortable with that idea than I am, but I don't like that at all. You can also use yarrow as an internal medicine. When it's taken internally, yarrow is decongestant and it provokes sweating, which breaks fevers. So that actually has a lot of uses if somebody is feeling very sick and low energy. Sometimes making them sweat will kind of break them out of that malaise. I've used it a lot during the pandemic for people who had fevers and coughing and things like that, because it contains a substance called camphorol, which is sort of it's a very aromatic decongestant, something sort of like the smell of cardamom or camphor. Has the same sort of cool aromatic note to it that those two substances have. So it can be used as a tea, and that's a really good way to use it for that. Works with all sorts of fever type illnesses and congestion type illnesses. Can help with allergies. Just as a simple decongestant, especially if somebody's got a situation where they're coughing when they try to lay down, or they're getting that postnasal drip and it's making them cough when they're in a lying position. It's really usually really helpful for that. Sweating is kind of a thing that can be provoked by a lot of herbs that is very much a part of traditional medicines all over the world. So plants that produce sweating are sometimes seen as purifying. I don't know that that's really, I mean, certainly there are some substances that come out when you sweat, but I think it's more a matter of getting the fluids moving in your body rather than literally removing waste products from your body through your sweat. Although some of both things do happen. But it often makes people feel better from a variety of different things if they break a sweat. It sets off some different psychological and neurological reactions, and changes your physiology some, and it invigorates circulation and that sort of thing. So it's really useful for all of that. Yarrow is also mildly antiseptic and slightly pain relieving. So wash or an alcohol extract of yarrow can be used for mouth sores, some teeth problems and things like that, just kind of as a way of delivering some bacteria killing properties at the same time as relieving pain and helping injury, small wound or whatever, to heal up.
Does yarrow also help stop bleeding?
Yeah, yarrow will help stop bleeding if it's applied to a bleeding place topically. I haven't really tried using yarrow internally to stop bleeding. I mean, it would stop bleeding from the digestive system because it's actually physically coming in contact with it if you take it as a liquid. Although, kind of, if there is bleeding in the digestive system, you kind of have to do your best to address why that's happening. But if it's something like a bleeding ulcer and you drank yarrow tea, it would stop bleeding from that. Bleeding from wounds, definitely, it causes the wounds to tighten up, causes tissues to heal together better, faster and stronger, and with less scarring, seemingly. So it's something that I've used quite a bit for that. Like I said, both here and in some other situations where I've treated some injuries that people would probably not come to an herbalist with in this country. Sometimes I was all there was. So it's a useful thing for a pretty wide variety of things. Also, it's the tea of yarrow, the water extract of yarrow can be used on the scalp for itchiness. If there are lice, it helps with that. If there's just itchiness from dandruff or something like that, it will help with that as well. So I've gotten a question of differences between flower and leaf. I never really use the flower by itself. I always use the flower and leaf together, or just the leaf, depending on what I have. I kind of tend to think the leaf has more in it of what makes it yarrow, but usually I use both together. But I think that, and there probably are, some substances in the flower, but I haven't really used that by itself, and I haven't really noticed a whole lot of difference medicinally in terms of efficacy and in terms of observable clinical differences. I haven't really noticed a lot of difference between when I had just leaves or when I had leaf and flower together. So I think they're pretty similar. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what is the best way to harvest without, I guess, over harvesting, disturbing it too much, and just being greedy with it? Like, I have like a whole patch of it. I don't want to like over harvest. I want to ensure it keeps coming back and all that. So what's the best way to go about that? And would you recommend drying it and then using it for whatever later, all that.
Yeah. Okay. So if I have a patch of yarrow, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to gather from about half of the plants in the yarrow patch, because it is actually something that is, if you look at a yarrow flowering head, you've got like a little umbrella shaped cluster of flowers. And if you look at each of those flowers, it's actually made up of a bunch of tiny little flowers. I mean, the umbel is made up of a bunch of tiny little flowers, but each of those is made up of a bunch of tiny little flowers. And so it's going to produce a lot of seeds. And so if you take half of them, that's more than I would gather from most plants, but it will keep growing. I usually take half of them, but I cut it 3/4 of the way down the stem. In other words, not all the way to the ground. And it will keep growing. It will grow. It will grow back from those plants, and it will also produce seeds from the plants that you didn't touch. And I find that being able to do that, I can get as much yarrow as I need. If you just have a small amount, like something that would fit in a brown paper grocery bag, I would just put it in that upside down where it's not going to get a lot of dust on it and where it's able to dry. And then strip the leaves. Once it's dry, just kind of break off the flowers and strip your hand down the stem and pull off the leaves. The stem you don't really need. It's mostly just fibrous material, doesn't have a lot of the medicine in it. So I usually don't use the stems, save them for the bonfire or whatever. And then the rest of it, the leaf and flower, keep that. I usually let it dry before I make it into a tincture, but I don't usually let it sit around for a long time. But it's easier to work with when it's dry. It's easier to know exactly how much of it you've got versus how much of it is water. So I usually will make that into a tincture. And sometimes I also make an oil out of it, an infused oil, which would be where you kind of pack the yarrow into a jar sort of loosely and then pour oil in on top of it. And then you let it sit for a while and it'll absorb a lot of that oil, and you pour some more in on top of that. And then you let it sit for a couple of weeks and then press the oil out of the plant material, squeeze it out. And then you get an oil that will have some of the smell and aromatic properties of the yarrow that can be used as like a chest rub. It can also be used on injuries, but I would usually use the tincture of the yarrow first and then maybe put the oil on over top of that because it's not as penetrating, but it helps to form a barrier. So, but anytime you're making an infused oil like that, you don't want it to be fresh herbs. You want it to be dried herbs. Otherwise, it's just going to turn moldy on you before you even get a chance for it to be done. It's possible to make oil extracts with fresh herbs, but it's very possible to mess it up. So it's not as good a way to do it. So, let it dry, and then you can make some of it into oil, some of it into tincture, keep some of it in a jar to use as tea if you wanted to use it that way. So that's about how I would go about handling it and processing it. And usually if you don't mow the yarrow and you let it grow and go to seed, it will come back year after year. The yarrow that I'm using is from where my mom lives in Clark County, and it was actually planted there from seeds from the farm that her husband's parents lived on in North Dakota, and they went and got seeds from it like decades later. It had been growing in the same spot on that farm for decades, and they got some and brought it to this new farm. So it's been growing there for almost 20 years now in the same spot. Probably yarrow would have grown there even if they hadn't introduced the seeds, because it's kind of everywhere. but they did, and it's growing in that spot. So presumably it's genetically descended from the yarrow on the other farm, although it could be hard to tell. But yeah, yarrow is it's a really good versatile herb. I mean, it's kind of like if you were going to pick one herb to keep with you at all times for first aid purposes, it would be a pretty solid choice. From what we can tell, people have found yarrow in archaeological sites going back many thousands of years, possibly going back to Neanderthal times, although it's kind of doubtful or uncertain as to whether the yarrow in those sites was maybe brought in later by animals carrying it in to line their nests or something like that, burrowing creatures. But it's been found, charred seeds of it have been found, which is a pretty good indicator. Charred seeds of it have been found in fire pits going back thousands and thousands of years ago. So it's something that humans have had a relationship with for a very long time. And like I said, it's mentioned in the Iliad, that's almost 3,000 years ago. That's like maybe 800 BC or so that story first started being told. So it's something that's been with us for a very long time, and it's kind of been used over a very wide swath of earth as well. So it was used there in the Mediterranean. It was used in the Middle East, in Asia, here in North America. So, a huge part of the world and a huge part of world history and presumably prehistory as well. And I think, a big reason for that is just because it's so versatile and because it's something that, is easy to come by and has a lot of applications, has a lot of practical uses for which it's really powerful.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited that I have yarrow. So
it's a good thing to have. And everybody who lives in North America should go out and look and see if you can find some yarrow. Look up some pictures of it if you don't know what it looks like. It's quite a recognizable plant. And you want to make sure that
my 10-year-old actually is the one that discovered that we had it, because I bought that field guide that you told us about. I had it sitting on the table and he was pilfering through it and he was like, "Oh, we have that." I was like, "Where?" And he took me right to it. It was really funny.
That's fantastic. That's great. Yeah, it's a good one to know, and an easy one to recognize once you know what it looks like. So all right, let's see. Any precautions when not to use? I would not use yarrow for someone who is newly pregnant or is trying to conceive. I don't actually know that it's going to interfere with that process at all, but it is blood moving. It can be used in large doses to induce a period in someone whose period is delayed and they're not pregnant. And there might be some dose at which it would be cause that to happen if someone were pregnant. So I usually tend to avoid it in people who are newly pregnant or are trying to become pregnant. Other than that, no, there's not a lot of precautions to it. It's a pretty safe herb. It's a pretty good one to know, partly because it's safe. Hang on a second. I got another question that I need to see. It got away before I could read it. How long will dry yarrow keep in a jar? At least until next year's yarrow grows. I would say a year pretty well, maybe 2 years. After 2 years, I think you would probably be able to tell some quality difference. Depending on, if you keep it out of direct light, because light will break down yarrow pretty quickly if it's in direct sunlight. So if you keep the jar somewhere dark, something like that, it will keep a good while. It will keep at least a year, possibly 2. So yeah, it'll keep a while. But again, you know, definitely you want to keep it out of sunlight because that will break it down faster. Just a second. All right. So any other questions about yarrow? All right. Any questions about anything else? I wanted to remind everybody that on the 28th, that's going to be when we go for the herb walk. If you want to attend that in person, let me know. I'm going to try and figure out how many people are going to come in person and base where we're going to look at plants, partly on how many of us are going to be going there. My plan is to also, you know, have that on Zoom as well, or failing that, to record it. But I'm hoping to be able to go somewhere where I'll have reception, be able to have it on Zoom and all that. But if you're able to come physically, for those of you who are around here, I think that that's a really good option. And we'll get together at 11 on Saturday and look at this Saturday, the 28th, and look at some different plants. And I think that really, you know, seeing the plants is a really useful step for everybody. Getting to see the plants firsthand, getting to touch them, and all that is a really good way to get to know them, get to learn them, not just intellectually, but physically. Like you have some physical connection to what this plant looks and feels like. And so, you know, coming on an herb walk with me is certainly not the only way to accomplish that, but it's one way that is, you know, might be worth doing. And, you know, in the meantime, of course, I encourage everybody to keep looking around you and looking at the plants that are growing around you, and, you know, be thinking about when you see plants that are growing, what factors are affecting that plant, what obstacles might that plant have to growing in the place that it's growing, what challenges might come with its particular location, pressures, you might say, and that sort of thing. And you know, one of you mentioned the field guide, and I think that if you haven't gotten a field guide yet, it's a good thing to have, really good resource to have. And so anyway, just if you are planning on going on the herb walk, that's going to be Saturday the 28th at 11, and location to be announced, but reach out to me, email me or whatever, and let me know if you are planning to come, so that I can try and select a location that would be appropriate to the number of people that are going to be there. Got a question of any other book recommendations. So I think that this is going to be depending on a little bit on where you live, but a publisher called Timber Press last year came out with a series of herbal medicine books for different bioregions in the US. And so there's one for the Southeast, and it's one that I really like. It's got a lot of pictures. I think it's really great for beginners. I bought a copy of it for my daughter. Let's see. I'm trying to find a picture of the cover to show you. Oh, well. I actually can't do that right now. Hang on just a second. Maybe I can.
I got a
Just
copy of it
second.
handy.
Oh, yeah. Hang on a second.
This one. This the book you're talking about?
Oh, I can't see you. Just a second.
It's a little dark down here, but
Hang on a second. Oh, yeah, that's the one. Southeast Medicinal Plants by Corey Pine Shane. It's a pretty good good book. It's kind of like a coffee table book because it's got a lot of pictures on every page. But they're good pictures, and it's written by somebody who actually does practice herbal medicine. It's not just written by a writer or whatever. It's written by a practitioner who has a good sense of what things are really work or whatever. And there are similar books in that series for different parts of the country. So if you're in the Pacific Northwest or the Rocky Mountains or something like that, that same publisher has multiple different books, and they're all written by reasonably knowledgeable people. If you're not in the United States, some of the plants that are in there would still be useful, but it might be some different stuff depending on where you live. I'd have to try and find something if anybody wants to know for a specific other area of the world. I have to try and find out what area and see what books might be good for that area. But I think everybody should have a field guide that talks about the plants where they live, because that's something you can get for just about anywhere in the world, and it's a really useful thing to have. And then if you know the plants, you can look up information about their effects. All right. Well, any other questions before we go?
is the walk on the 28th also going to be about 2 hours?
Yeah, it'll be about the same amount of time. Yeah. All right. Well, if anybody thinks of any questions, feel free to email me. And otherwise, thank you all for coming. And I will see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good night.
Good night.